non-relational way of seeing ourselves. It is not that we could not be relational, it is just that we lost sight of cuddle relationship and the way we saw each other in that context. In the tree of the knowledge of non-relational structures, based in what we perceive as good and evil, we now see others in a dualistic system of scales, of things that are better or worse. In the end, we are left to measure ourselves by ourselves. This was driven by our consciousness of it, sometimes referred to as the conscience. The institution we call church spends a lot of time sharpening this horrible instrument that came about as a result of the fall. They spend a lot of time sharpening a person's conscience. It's almost every sermon that's preached has something to do with sharpening this horrible instrument. The slightest nick, as a result, can cut to the bone of a person's soul and tear it and shred it like it was never meant to be. This is very unhealthy, a very unhealthy way to live. As a result of the garden events, God had a real issue on his hands. Adam lost sight of who God was and who he was. As a result of losing sight of who God was. Ever since, God has been attempting to reveal to us who he is, but doing it in the context of our reality. In regards to Abraham, for example, the people of his day would offer things to God. And if they had a bad crop, they would assume they did not offer God enough. So the next harvest, they would offer more. If they did happen to have a good harvest, and it was better than last year's harvest, they had to decide, do I give more this year than last year, since the harvest was better? I mean, we don't want to get God upset with us, for not recognizing him giving us a good harvest. On and on it went. It was always more and more, continually. It was never enough. Pleasing the gods always required more until they would eventually even begin cutting themselves or even cutting off their own body parts and even sacrificing their own children. In this reality, we see God entering into the picture, picking out a heathen among heathens. And he says to Abraham, take your son and offer him as a sacrifice to me. For Abraham, this is nothing new. It is what was required in order to please the gods. So off he goes to sacrifice his son. The whole point God was making to Abraham within the context of his reality is stop with all the bullshit. I am not a God that requires. I am a God that provides. Can we please stop with all this crap? What is it that Abraham shouted as he descended from the mountain? Jehovah Jireh. God provides. My God, the provider. He does not require. Look what we have done with this. How many sermons have we heard in the institution we call church that suggest that we too need to be willing to put everything on the altar for God? Can we please stop with all the bullshit? I can hardly take it anymore. We should be putting these people in insane asylums, not behind pulpits. Really, can we just stop? Moving forward to the Mosaic Law then, what do we see? Well, we still have people locked into this non-relational way of seeing each other, themselves, and God. God chose Israel to reveal himself to the rest of the world. Thus, from the one man Abraham, God begins to work through a nation to reveal himself to all humanity. How do you encourage people to live relationally as God is relational when people see themselves in a non-relational frame? Well, I don't know how you would do it, but what God did was give the Israelites a way to deal with their non-relational crap. And in that, they could settle down their conscience and be free to live relationally, even though they were still blind to the relational image they were created in. In other words, once the non-relational was settled, they were free to live relationally. Using the analogy that Christ uses, he essentially poured the Mosaic Law into the wineskin of conscience and morality in order to free people to live relationally. In other words, by pouring the non-relational Mosaic Law into the wineskin of non-relational conscience and morality, it would settle things down in that regard so they could live relationally. The dirty little secret is that if you pour relational things into the non-relational, it blows up just like when you pour a new wine into an old wineskin. Thus, the old wineskin was the non-relational frame of morality and conscience, and the best wine God could pour into it was the non-relational Mosaic law. That is, until Christ came to deal with the whole issue. While they could love one another, they had no idea what the love looked like that flowed from communion, union, and distinction. The type of relationship that exists in God, the context in which God exists in, is communion, union, and distinction. It's the image of God that we were created in. They were blind to this context in which love flowed from. So love, it's a great thing, but love that flows from any other context other than communion, union, and distinction can become very destructive. However, everything within the Mosaic law did point toward the new wine and the new wineskin to come. The Mosaic law was the shadow of what came in Christ. It could not contain the substance of the relational, but it could point us in that direction until Christ came in relational truth and relational grace, as John suggested in his gospel in the first chapter, even repeating it for emphasis. It is in this new wineskin and wine that we can once again begin to see and participate in our original design in the relational image and relational likeness of God. So what we see then is all these non-relational systems in place to deal with people in a non-relational way so the people of Israel could be freed to live relationally. Think of it this way. It is difficult to enjoy life until what ails us is dealt with. The Mosaic law settled down what ailed us, or what ailed them. It didn't remove it, but gave them relief from it. Thus they could live relationally. The pinnacle event within this non-relational Mosaic law structure was the atonement that happened once a year. It was the holiest of the holy holidays, and the time in which the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies in the temple to represent the entire nation of Israel and atone for their sin. The priest would take 2 goats and cast lots to see which one would be killed and which one would be set free into the desert, essentially to die. The blood of the first goat placed onto the second by the hand of the high priest, who would also sprinkle blood on many of the things within the Holy of Holies. It is the cross that penetrates into this most holy of all non-relational structures within the Mosaic law. The declaration of the cross to humanity is that once and for all we can be done with all of our non-relational structures that have emerged as a result of the garden event. In fact, the best of the best at fulfilling these non-relational structures still killed the Messiah, while standing firmly upon their non-relational structures, in fact. Man's non-relational structures, in the end, even killed God. And just to be sure and make the point, God tore the veil of the Holy of Holies from top to bottom, the place in which the pinnacle event of the non-relational structures took place. The veil of non-relationship had been removed. Can we just stop with all the non-relational stuff? The cross, the declaration of the cross suggests that we stop with all the scapegoating, that we stop with all the whole moral thing that has been driven by our conscience and sharpened to the point of ridiculousness by the institution we call church. In fact, morality is one of the best ways to disseminate hatred without exposing oneself as hateful. Even self-hatred. Much of morality turns upon itself and becomes a hatred of self in the context of morality and conscience. It's a very horrible, hellish way to live. Church history alone declares how hateful morality can be as it's disseminated on others. That, fortunately, has been exposed. Tragically, the Israelites continued to offer sacrifices in the temple for the next 37 years, until the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. But the tragedy of tragedies is that for 2 millennia, the institution we call church has been insisting on promoting a non-relational frame and pouring love relationship into it. It blows up every time it's tried. Is it any wonder our teenagers rebel? or that the world is in the fix it is in. This leads to a loss of meaning and value and purpose, what one of my friends calls the MVP of life, the loss of which leads to nihilism. Welcome to America, and welcome to the American church. This is outrageous and completely devastating to our souls. In every sense of the word, it literally sucks the life out of us until there's nothing left. Our darkness and blindness become a black hole in which nothing can escape. And in this we are left with a strive and suppressed reality. More striving to become spiritual and Christ-like, and more suppressing things about ourselves we don't like or can't even bear to look at. As one person described it, the hamster is dead, but the hamster wheel is still spinning. We, in the end, seek ways in which to spin the wheel and keep it spinning. Churches have become great wheel spinners. This is really, really sick stuff. To finish up then, I want to address the issue of conscience and morality with a couple of observations. First, it is not that we are to ignore the conscience or sharpen the conscience. We are to dethrone the conscience. Our conscience, if it is bothering us, by all means we need to deal with it. But it is not to rule our hearts and minds. We have been invited to participate in cuddle relationship. Thus, even as Paul suggests, all things, might be lawful or permissible in a non-relational sense. Even so, all things are not relationally beneficial. We are to preserve and protect cuddle relationship by living in union and communion without losing distinction or trampling on the distinction of others. For example, if someone is hammering on our distinction, we need to deal with that, or to get others to help us deal with it. I don't have the space to expand on this here much, but a lot could be said, and ultimately my hope is that a lot of people begin writing in this regard in order to help us to move forward in understanding cuddle relationship, and in that understanding who God is and who we are. In terms of society in general, what do we do then? This becomes a real issue because the rest of the world is living in this blindness that, like much of the church is, and so the basis of society is still on this idea of non-relational morality, and in many cases driven by conscience. And so this is what the conversation is about. So lots of people, are still blind to cuddle relationship, and this is the truth both inside and outside the church. So what do we do? Well, Paul actually addresses this in Romans 13 when he talks about civil authorities. God has allowed them to remain to deal with those that insist on living in a non-relational frame, such as morality and conscience, which can be defined in many ways. The ideas of tolerance and intolerance are another way that's used commonly today. In other words, this then frees the ecclesia to live in cuddle relationship and invite others to do the same and participate in the same. This is what ecclesia was meant to be about, in inviting others to participate in what they've been included in through Christ, to participate in cuddle relationship. A relational system instead of a non-relational system. In fact, Matthew 18, we see that if within the church someone begins to live a non-relational way, there is a process of dealing with it. And in the end, if they insist on living in a non-relational frame, then the end result, after going to the person yourself and taking another and then taking them before the church as it suggests, however you want to define that, the end result is that if they insist on living in a non-relational frame, you treat them as anyone else in the world, that lives in a non-relational frame. But what that means is we continue to love them, we treat them with respect, realizing that at the core of them is Jesus Christ, and that they also were created in the image and likeness of God in cuddle relationship and have always been intended to participate in it. So Matthew 18 has nothing to do with kicking people out of the church, as many seem all too happy to suggest. So I will leave it here for the time being. Obviously, there's a lot more I could say, and that could be said, but it'll have to wait for another video. If you have a desire to understand more about the soul and what is going on, how to deal with our black hole, as it's sometimes described, I recommend Bruce Walchop. That's spelled Chope. He's from Australia. He's doing great work down there, and he actually is a professional in the field and has also delved into the areas of theology. And he has very good information on this kind of stuff in terms of our dealing with our soul and what has come about even as a result of what the church promotes. And then also Baxter Kruger from Mississippi has some very helpful things. He does a lot of writing. Both these guys have a lot of videos available. Wochope, I don't believe, has finished his book yet, but Kruger has several books available. So I encourage you to look up him as well. So both of them have videos. Wochope has some that are very good that are for purchase. They're very inexpensive. I highly recommend that you download them from his site. If you're looking for some refreshing things in terms of your true identity in Christ, I recommend the Mirror Bible. It's a New Testament Bible. It's not even completed yet, but we have many of the things that have been completed available to us. It's been made available to us, and things continuously are added. But it's a very, very good translation in terms of identity. The primary focus there is understanding who we are and understanding who God is, which is ultimately the ultimate overriding view of what the scriptures are trying to reveal to us. So any videos that you can find by a guy by the name of Andre Rabe, R-A-B-E, or Francois du Toit. Both of these guys are South African. They work together for many years and travel around the world doing mirror schools. Francois du Toit is actually the author of the Mirror Bible. Du Toit is D-U space T-O-I-T, I believe. Francois, F-R-A-N-C-O-I-S. So anyway, those are some resources if people are interested in looking at some of this further in terms of who we are, who God is, and how we fit into that, what our identity is, dealing with our soul as a result of what we've come to believe that's ultimately mostly pagan, this non-relational frame that we ended up in as a result of the garden, and is now being promoted by the church. So Paul ultimately reminds us that we are now a people who can look into the mirror and see ourselves in the glory of our original design, in the relational image and relational likeness of God that we were created in. But now also in the glory of our new life, in our inclusion in the uncreated spirit life of God. In other words, passing from one glory in creation into the glory of our inclusion in uncreated